This week, we will be reading a story titled Flat Stanley, His Original Adventure by Jeff Brown and pictures by Mackie Panaton. We will be reading a chapter each day this week, and we will be focusing on vocabulary words for each chapter and comprehension skills. Chapter 1, The Big Bulletin Board. Breakfast was ready. "I will go wake the boys," Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband, George Lambchop. Just then, their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. "Hey, come and look, hey!" Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were both very much in favor of politeness and careful speech. "Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people," Mr. Lambchop said as they entered the bedroom. "Try to remember that." "Excuse me," Arthur said, "but look!" He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay the enormous bulletin board that Mr. Lambchop had given the boys a Christmas ago so that they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley. Before we continue reading, I want to focus on the word enormous. Now, when we think of the word enormous, I tried to emphasize it as I read enormous bulletin board. Enormous means very large or gigantic. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would still have been sleeping if he had not been woken by his brother's shout. "What's going on here?" he called out cheerfully from beneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed. "Heavens," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Gosh," said Arthur, "Stanley's flat." "As a pancake," said Mr. Lambchop. "Darndest thing I've ever seen." "Let's all have breakfast," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Then Stanley and I will go see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say." In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley all over. So now let's focus on the word examined. Many of you have probably been to the doctor before and been examined. It's when something is looked at very carefully. So a doctor may examine your throat or your ears to see how you are. Let's continue reading. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Does it hurt very much?" "I feel sort of tickly for a while after I got up." It says, "I felt sort of tickly for a while after I got up," Stanley Lambchop said, "but I feel fine now." "Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases," said Dr. Dan. "We'll just have to keep an eye on this young fellow," he said when he had finished the examination. "Sometimes we doctors, despite all our years of training and experience, can only marvel at how little we really know." So I want to focus on the word marvel. Marvel means to look at something with wonder or surprise. So even with all the studies that the doctors do, they still marvel at what they really don't know yet and how to fix it. Mrs. Lambchop said she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered by the tailor now, so Dr. Dan told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements. Okay, a tailor is somebody who fixes clothing so that it fits people better. Mrs. Lambchop wrote them down. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. Now, if you remember from thinking about math, an inch is just about the size of your thumb width-wise. So that's about how wide he is. He is not very big. You are now going to answer some questions on this chapter that we just read. So I want you to make sure you look back and think about what we read. Don't just make guesses. You could always look back into the passage and try to find the answer. We're also going to be focusing on the 4 words that we went over. Enormous, which means very large in size. Examined, when you look at something or someone very carefully. Marvel, when you're filled with wonder or surprise. And then a tailor, which is a person who fixes clothing so it fits other people better.